Welcome to the Coming Home Well podcast, the show that educates, supports, and advocates for the veteran community. Your host, Dr. Tyler Pieron, U.S. Army retired, will bring you exciting conversations with amazing guests about resources, research, and military history, all geared to helping our warriors to come home well. Here's your host, Dr. Tyler Pieron.
Welcome back to Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Tyler Pieron, and we're going to do something we've never done on Coming Home Well. We have a poet that is going to talk about their creative process, their inspiration, but more importantly, and I think especially for our audience, is that they're a military spouse who's dealt with many, many years of dealing with all the things that are somewhat universal, but also very special to being a military spouse. There's a lot of things that, well, if you haven't experienced it, you can get a lot of insight into reading their poems, which I think is pretty amazing. It's really kind of cool. We've talked a lot about expressing yourself, and we've had authors and guitar and music and dance and screenwriters and all sorts of things, but never a poet. So I'm really excited to introduce Jehanne Dubrow. Is an author of 9 poetry collections and 3 books of nonfiction. That's a lot of writing and a lot of poetry, but they have a new set. There's 2 out. The 3rd is coming out soon, of really military spouse poem collections, which I'm not going to go into all the details now because I want to get a little more details, but there's 3 of them. 2 are out. 1's on the way. Jehanne, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well.
Thank you, Tyler, for that lovely welcome. I'm delighted to be here.
So this isn't just a hobby. You do this all the time.
Yeah, I mean, not only do I write and publish, but I also teach writing for a living. I'm a professor of creative writing at the University of North Texas, where mostly I teach poetry, but I also teach occasionally nonfiction. And my scholarly background is in Holocaust studies, war literature, and trauma studies. So I teach sometimes in those topics too.
What a fascinating thing. I have a colleague that is a Holocaust researcher and academic, and he's over in the Hague right now doing research. And there's a lot of things that people think they know about that topic that you really don't until you go into the deep dive. And I happen to read all of his papers just because I speak English really well, and he's gotten much better though over the years. It is funny. And so I've learned about the Armenian genocide and all these things that I had no idea really about, except as a blurb in a history book. And all of a sudden learning about shared identities and all sorts of things. So not to diverge too much, you're a military spouse, or were, or always? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my husband in 2019 retired from a 20-year career in the Navy. He was a surface warfare officer for most of his career.
That's on the boats, right?
That's right. That's on the boats. When he first started out, he came in and enlisted, and then they sent him to officer candidate school, and they didn't know what to do with him. So first they sent him to nuke school, and then they sent him to Pensacola to fly, and finally they put him on ships. And during the first 15 years of our marriage, we probably only lived together a total of about 1.5 years, and that was not consecutively. I had a career as an academic, and as you know, professors' jobs aren't portable. When you teach at a university, you're there. And so we had essentially the first 15 years of our marriage, it was a long distance marriage. And, I would see him every once in a while. It wasn't uncommon for us to go 9 months without seeing one another, if he was overseas. Mm-hmm. And it was intensely difficult on the marriage. There were times
I would imagine.
there were many times I thought we might not make it. And also I went into the marriage sort of ignorant or maybe overly sort of wearing rose-colored glasses about what the experience would be like. My parents were U.S. Foreign Service officers,
Mhm.
so I spent my entire childhood moving every 3 years. I had
You
had
and I
plenty,
both, yes,
yeah,
same lifestyle.
had plenty of contact with military families because anytime you're at an embassy, there are also Marines assigned
Mhm.
to guard the embassy. So I thought I sort of got it. I spent a lot of time at on bases or going to commissaries. When we lived in communist Poland in the 1980s, we would drive every 3 or 4 months to West Berlin, and we would go to the PX and the commissary, and it was very exciting for me to get
Mhm.
to eat American food. So I thought I knew what military life was like. And I think the part that I had not really thought seriously about was the uncertainty. Um, and I also thought, well, my husband is on a ship. It's not that dangerous. And so I could sort of think like, oh, I can escape the scary parts of a military marriage. But it was the early 2000s and early on in our marriage within
That's
the
some
first
bad
year.
timing.
Yeah, early on in our marriage, all of a sudden it looked like he might be sent on an individual augmentation. Um, and I freaked out because all of a sudden I realized he could be sent in country to like
Mhm.
Afghanistan or Iraq. Um,
And not safe on a ship.
no, and
Well,
that was the
relative safe.
I didn't appreciate that even on a ship you can get really badly hurt.
Oh yeah.
That essentially, a military vessel is like an active construction site, and it's
Hmm.
very easy to.
Without OSHA. There's no OSHA shutting things down.
So very quickly I started realizing that I had been rather innocent. And that was how I started to write poems about my military marriage. And the first book that I wrote about that experience is called Stateside.
Hmm.
And it
And
looked
that's
at
the first of the trilogy.
that's right. And of course, I didn't know I was writing a trilogy. I was like, I'm writing this one book and then I'm moving on to the other subjects that I want to write about. And so Stateside was about the before, during, and after of a deployment and sort of the journey that the military spouse can go through.
Hmm.
And I finished that book. It was published in 2010. I was working on other projects, publishing other things. And after Stateside came out, I read at civilian and military institutions around the country. And very quickly I thought, oh, I'm part of these two communities. I'm an academic and I'm a military spouse. And I was reading in both of those kinds of spaces, and I had several realizations. One was that everyone was cranky with me. I would go to I would go to a
I
base.
laugh because I get it.
Yeah, I would go to a base and I'd read, and there'd be these military spouses in the room, and I could feel they were really excited and grateful to hear their perspective voiced in a genre that's considered like high art.
Hmm.
Um, Traditionally, the military spouse experience has not been part of poetry, even though the history of poetry in general is dominated by war poetry and especially poetry written by soldier poets.
Oh yeah.
Uh, but there was no perspective of the military spouse. So I would read these poems, and the spouses would be super grateful, but their active duty service members would sometimes be like a little bit annoyed. Like,
Really?
hey, yes, because I think there was this sort of feeling like even articulating that being in a military marriage is difficult was seen as somehow like breaking a silence, or, that you were supposed to like and carry on and sort of like pretend like, oh no, this is just part of the job. But the fact is, it is really hard to be in a military marriage, and I think for both people.
I don't think anybody has it quite as hard as 15 months and 15 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's almost like a prison sentence.
Yeah, I mean, it was every time we saw one another, it was like two strangers reintroducing themselves.
Yes.
So after, like, because I was reading at military institutions and universities where the response was often negative because Culturally, people were sort of predisposed to talk about things like the military industrial complex. And
Hmm.
so there was sort of hostility towards service. And I started to think it's really terrible that these communities don't talk to each other. You know, in academia should be thinking about military service. And on the military side of things, there should be conversations happening in academia so that people are better informed about what service means and the ways it can transform people both positively and negatively. And so that's how I came to write the second book in the series, which is called Dots and Dashes, thinking about Morse code with the
Yeah.
title, but also like thinking about the way that when you're in this kind of relationship, sometimes it does feel like you're communicating to someone from very far away using a kind of basic technology. Um,
Or in
and
code almost.
or in code, yeah. And so that was the second book. And then I really thought to myself, okay, I'm done with this topic. And then my husband started to prepare for his retirement, and I was very excited because, frankly, our marriage, I don't think could have withstood another 5 years, if he'd served to 25 years.
I don't know that many marriages would have survived regardless.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I mean, it's
that is a tremendous strain on
inc-
any relationship.
completely. So, you know, I started to think, okay, he's going to be transformed by this retirement. He was having to do things that he'd never done, like
There's a
write.
light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, but it was also clear, like, oh, this is going to be a complete transformation for him. And then I realized, well, but that means it's going to be complete transformation for me too.
Oh yeah.
And so that's how I came to write the final book in the series, Civilians, because I started thinking about what happens after when we both have in some ways the same level, like the same label. He's no longer identified by like his rank, um, or the information that's on his dog tags. I no longer have this little piece of plastic that says dependent on it, a label that always freaked me out as a very sort of independent. We're both just going to be called civilians. And I remember looking up the definition of civilians in the dictionary, and it's a word that's defined by what you are not. So when you look up the definition of civilian, it's somebody who is not a combatant. And I thought, well, what does it mean to have an identity defined by negation? And that question of like, well, what's the negation replaced with? What do you become in the absence of uniforms and in some ways uniformity?
Mm-hmm.
And
it's
so
a
that
very, very significant change
very,
after 2 decades of service. It's one of the biggest things that we deal with at Coming Home Well is your
yeah,
identity is no longer I'm Captain so-and-so or Major or Lieutenant Commander or Chief this or Chief that. You're Bob.
yeah,
And Bob don't have a job. Bob
yes,
doesn't have a purpose. I don't know your husband's name, but I'm just using that as an example.
yeah.
All of a
His name is
sudden,
his name
things
is
are changing.
Jeremy.
Jeremy doesn't have a job. Things are changing.
Yeah,
And your identity of who you are is no longer wrapped up in what you do.
that's right. That's right. And I mean, I would tease him because I'd say, oh, you've replaced one uniform with this new uniform of like khakis and a generic plaid button down.
We call it the officer special.
Yes. And I mean, in some ways that was true, but I think basically he was like trying to figure out, well, what's this new life going to look like?
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, I had moved across country to start a new academic job. When I bought our house here in Texas, he was in Japan, and I mean, I had to do things like, sort of say to him, well, here's what the house looks like. What do you think? Which I think is a fairly typical experience in a military marriage.
Oh, many times rented or bought houses almost sight unseen.
That's right. But I realized like this was the last time that was going to happen. We would be making decisions together in the same state, perhaps in the same room. And so it also
Perhaps.
So it also meant a profound like shift in our relationship in terms of things would be messier. Like there would no longer be his domain and my domain.
Mhm.
And so that was a real adjustment. And so Civilians tries to sort of map out what that looks like.
So 20 years, essentially, you're at a 20-year marriage learning to live with each other.
That's right, almost like newlyweds.
Yeah.
And I mean, as anyone knows, like that first year of marriage under normal circumstances is pretty wild. You know,
Yeah.
you're trying to learn the other person's habits. It's not that you're thinking about the battle rhythms, you're thinking about like the day-to-day rhythms. You know, and
Laundry and dishwashers and who
Exactly.
takes out the dog and
Yes, all that stuff. And in
what
fact,
side of the bed do you sleep on? All these things.
there's even a poem in the book where we're having a terrible argument about stacking the dishwasher.
I
Uh,
read it and I laughed because there's an old saying about one needs to do it super neatly and organized in an intentional way, and the other's like a rabid raccoon yeeting
yes.
it right in there and hitting go.
And we would both claim that both of us stacked the dishwasher like an architect, but
Mm.
apparently we were different kinds of architects. Yeah,
Who's an
so
engineer? An engineer
you're
that
an
builds things that
engineer.
barely just falls down. That's the real value of an engineer. So it's called Civilians, and so you're really it's the third of the trilogy,
Yeah.
arcing this flow. And I'm really curious. You write poems. How do you know when you have a book? Like, because they're independent, but they're linked in sort of there's a lot of context. But
Yes.
but that's a hard thing for me to. I wouldn't know where that line was.
Yeah, so when I'm working on a collection of poetry, usually it's unified by like a story or a shared theme.
Mhm.
And I try to think of each poem in the book like a little chapter in a novel, or in a memoir. In other words, the book from first poem to last is tracing out a kind of story.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I organizing a poetry book is really hard actually,
I
because
That's why I asked, because I was like, I've read two of the three, and I've read Civilians, and I was like, okay, where does this fit in? I'm like
yeah,
trying to understand the math of it
yeah, you're
and the
basically like,
flow.
yeah, you're basically putting poems next to one another, and sometimes, depending on how you reshuffle a manuscript, it can
Mhm.
dramatically change what feels like, you know, the structure of the book. For me, I knew the book needed to start by sort of reacclimating readers to like, hey, here are some of the challenges of being married to war.
Mhm.
And then by the end of the book, I wanted to get to that after, like so, a real civilian life, and show some of the growing pains of what's that like. All three of the books, Stateside, Dots and Dashes, and Civilians, also all engage with like the history of war literature, and especially the ancient Greeks, because it was Homer with the Iliad and the Odyssey who gave us sort of the original tradition in Western literature of war poetry.
Right? The most famous poetry of all time.
That's
And
right.
we study it, but we don't really think of it as, oh, that's war stuff.
That's right. And
Even though it's
so
all about war, but
completely. And like if we think about, say, the Iliad teaches us about the rage of the soldier. The whole book is built around Achilles and his rage.
Mhm.
And the Odyssey teaches us about homecoming and about the grief of Odysseus. And then if you sort of want to add a third book, it would be Virgil's Aeneid, in which we learn about the duty of the soldier. And those three books together essentially paint almost the whole picture.
Yeah.
Um, for me, the book that I care about the most is the Odyssey. One, because it has probably the first example of a military wife in poetry through the figure of Penelope, who's waiting for Odysseus to come home, and she's doing everything she can to keep the home front together. She's also raising a son, Telemachus, all on her own. And so, in fact, when I wrote Stateside, I went and looked, okay, at the history of war literature, and I said, I want to find examples of military spouses. And essentially, the only really good one who I could find was Penelope. And I would give readings from Stateside, and I would explain, like, here's Penelope. She's kind of my role model. But I would also say, look, the Odyssey is sort of an old book. Like, isn't it time?
Kind of an old book.
Isn't it time that military spouses were able to find themselves in new pieces of literature? Because the vision of the soldier has continually updated itself since Homer's time. We've always, throughout literary history, been given many examples of the soldier in all facets of the soldier's experience. But the military spouses remained a more shadowy figure.
I'm really surprised at that. You'd think that, especially with the Civil War,
yes,
and the World War II, the two major conflicts, obviously World War I, but that was a little bit different. But, the mass mobilization, different circumstances, different times. And we have a lot of literature from there.
Yes.
But not anything I can think of. Maybe it's buried in the annals of history.
Especially not from written by a military spouse.
Mm-hmm.
We have depictions of women, but they're frequently depictions of women written by men.
Right.
And
Here's how you should be.
That's
woman.
Right. So, that was part of my goal in Stateside, was to sort of like give a new perspective on this ancient experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Penelope is a big figure in that book. And in Civilians, I returned to Homer. There are a couple of poems in there that engage with the Iliad and the Odyssey, but I also look to the Roman poet Ovid, whose book Metamorphoses is all about all these famous transformations that we know from Greek mythology. Because I thought, like, how do I write about the transformation that this marriage is experiencing? And when in doubt, I always go back to the literature to see what's been written before and how can I have a conversation with it. And so the whole middle portion of this book is a kind of retelling of Ovid's Metamorphoses, but through the figure of this husband soldier. And sort of like finding him in all these different stories of transformation from the ancient Roman poet.
So, folks, if you go read the book, you don't need to have a degree in ancient philosophy, ancient poetry, and none of that. It's engaged with, but it has context. It doesn't require some a classical education in order to really understand. That's
you don't need a PhD.
You don't need to, be super history buff to really engage it. It's brought in and sort of flows with the other stories, because you do go from ancient history to, the dishwasher, an everyday kind of thing that I'm sure everyone, whether they're military family or not, have had that discussion. But coming from a context where over 20 years, you're really only together a year and a half, and that's all new discovery.
That's right.
Meanwhile, your husband's going through probably one of the most significant personal changes he's going to have until he retires.
Yeah.
Of who he is and who you are and who are you, both of you together. And I think you really address that confluence of lots of emotions, lots of things happening, and sort of the ice on the river, trying to walk across, and you're not sure where to step, and you don't want to be too timid, but at the same time you don't want to go in the water. There's a lot of trepidation with how and why and what is happening. That was my take on the work as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, for me, oftentimes I think I'm just writing about marriage in general, because as unique as a military marriage can be, in many cases, I feel like a lot of what happens in a military marriage is just a sort of heightened version of what happens in any marriage.
Just accelerated.
Yes, accelerated and intensified. Like, I was trying to explain to somebody recently, when you're in a marriage and you've known this person for a very long time, there are moments when you think, I truly know this person. And yet there are other moments in which you think, this person is a complete mystery to me. And that's sort of how I feel about my husband's military service. I often didn't understand it, or it perplexed me, or it made me feel uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Um, but to me, that felt more like a metaphor for marriage in general, that no matter how well you know somebody, there's always a part of them that remains unreachable and sort of hard to fathom. And so,
Especially when they have another life.
yes, yeah, both people have other lives,
Right.
and
It's, you're
and
teaching, he's on a boat. There's
and the
and it's not
question,
like you're doing that feedback loop every day and you're the little quirks. When you're deployed a
absolutely,
lot
yeah.
and you're gone, it's an entirely different world. And many times, I know veterans, I can speak for myself, I suppose I could speak for a lot of others. We don't really mention the dangerous, boring, horrible things except to get a laugh or to complain. But most of the time, it's just sort of how it is, and you don't think that it's something worth sharing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's no guarantee that the two people are going to grow and change in parallel, complementary ways. Like it's much likelier that these two people will diverge.
Hmm.
And so I think it's kind of miraculous if you somehow in this sort of relationship manage to find ways of reuniting emotionally,
Hmm.
because there's just no guarantee.
Oh,
Uh,
sure.
it's such a profound, I think both sides are profound. I think the experience of service is, I mean, there are so many interesting intellectual and philosophical questions that come into play. And for the person waiting at home, there's these questions about like, well, how do I sort of remain frozen for this other person? And is that even desirable to like remain fixed and unchanging? Um,
And it's contrary to nature.
It is. And I mean, especially, look, I'm like I said before, I struggled with the term dependent because I'm
Hmm.
such an independent woman and I have lots of fancy degrees and I've worked really hard at my career. And that kind of thing made me uncomfortable. And it unnerved me to think, wait, am I supposed to wait here unchanging like a woman in a novel from the 19th century?
Set up
Um,
with a glass jar over you and
yeah, exactly.
static, unchanging.
And so for me, I really struggled with like, is it better to continue to evolve as a person would, or is it better for the marriage to kind of stay fixed and frozen? And a lot of my poems, I think, grapple with that question because I want to be wholly myself, but of course, I also want my marriage to prosper and
Hmm.
continue to flower. So that I think that's been an ongoing sort of question for me. And I think my books grapple with that issue, which again, perhaps exists in any marriage, but is really so heightened in a military marriage where you've got these elements of danger and distance,
Hmm.
and they really make powerful changes on both people.
And loneliness and frustration and a lot of different, very powerful emotions that
Yeah.
are very legitimate and very, very accurate. And how do you deal with that? And even people with very strong marriages have a very hard time with that
Yeah.
because their distance is very, very difficult to deal with, but also all of the other components you were just mentioning. So let me ask you something that I think would be interesting to me, but also for people that might be interested in getting into creative writing or
Yeah.
poetry, or how do you do it? What's the process?
I mean, you obviously have to have a desire, whatever kind of art you pursue, you have to have a desire to make something and a belief that your perspective might matter if you can just make it, get it right, get the piece of art right.
Hmm.
I mean, for me, I wrote my first poem when I was 12. And it was about seagulls. I don't know why. Um, and I wrote it because all of a sudden I heard some language in my mind and I thought, oh, I want to write this down. Um, and in some ways, all these years later, the process hasn't changed that much for me. As a poet, I'm always listening to the sound of words and listening for little phrases or sentences that strike me as beautiful, and then pursuing, like, where does that sentence take me, or where does that phrase take me? Um, I think, look, I did a lot of schooling to become a poet, but anyone who's interested in writing can look for like a writing class in their community. In most places in the U.S., there are free or very inexpensive community writing classes that are open to everybody. In the military community, there are now many, many writing classes specifically for active duty members, as well as veterans and their families.
And we've had a bunch on Coming Home Well, which
Yes.
is why I'm so surprised I haven't had a poet on before. Because, like I love these things, and I think it's just such a wonderful, creative, and healthy outlet for creative expression. But I've never had a poet on, and I was like, oh, this is perfect.
Well, and one of the things about, like, I don't write for therapy, but I think it's very possible for many people to use um, any kind of creative writing to have therapeutic value. And I think that's because as you write something, you actually figure out what you thought about that thing. And the writing is an act of discovery. If you come to the page and you already know what you're going to say, that's much less exciting and much less likely to lead to beautiful art than when you come and the process of writing teaches you, oh, this is what I think about this experience that I had, or this conversation that I had with somebody else, or this thing that I saw. And so, I think that's, of course, one of the reasons why creative writing has become an essential tool in the medical humanities for helping many vets return. If they're struggling, say, with some kind of post-traumatic stress, writing or making art in general can be incredibly helpful for processing and coming to terms with an experience. And I think that's partly because these are disciplines. Poetry is an artistic discipline, and the word discipline is, I think, actually important because you end up having to write into a form, into a shape, into a set of constraints. And those rules that are associated with the art form actually help you to make discoveries and become more creative. So for instance, I write a lot in what's known as formal verse. I write in rhyme and I write in meter. I write things like sonnets. And working in these old traditional forms of poetry is a discipline that allows me to make powerful discoveries that I might not have been able to make otherwise.
You talk about all these different styles, and prior to our talking, I was telling my wife about, hey, I'm going to talk to a poet, and and she warned me not to do any poet jokes like I'm a poet and you didn't know it, or and so she said that is verboten, do not do that. And I laughed and I said, well, that is poetry in a way, the simple rhymes that we teach our kids. But there's a lot of other poetry. There's a lot of different rules that can be applied.
Yeah.
And if you don't know them, you may recognize them as they're happening as some style or another, even if you don't know the name. Iambic pentameter or
and these things are not like
haikus and all these things.
Yeah, it's not like these things are a secret closed society. Anybody
Yes.
can learn about this stuff. I prefer like the joke about she's a poet and she didn't know it to usually what I hear is when I tell somebody I write poetry, people have had such traumatic experiences studying poetry in middle school and high school that usually what they'll say is, oh, I hate poetry, or I'm scared of poetry. And that always makes me sad because I always feel like, oh, anybody can love a poem if you just have the right introduction to poetry or the
Yeah,
right
don't
teacher.
feed into it. You must do these particular things
That's right. You
as
have to have
opposed to.
somebody who like helps you to understand like how why poems do what they do and how they do these things.
So
Um,
we've talked a lot about poems. I think we should probably read one
okay.
because I was like, I read a number of them and I was like, oh, maybe I'll read one on when I'm talking to you. And then I realized I'm not sure where to put the emphasis or how to get the emotion. I obviously have my own emotions when I'm reading it or my
Yeah.
own thoughts, but then because it's not a traditional, like, iambic pentameter or rhyming, it's a little bit different. And
Yeah.
so as I was reading it, I'm like, oh, okay, how would I say that? And it was almost like lines, like
Yeah.
if you've seen it like a screenplay. And I was like, maybe that was a good analogy. Maybe it isn't, but that's what I
No,
was
it
thinking.
is a good analogy because the basic building block of any poem is the line.
Hmm.
Um, so you're already like engaging in literary analysis without even realizing it. So I thought actually I will read a poem that is in iambic pentameter and that does
Oh,
have
cheating. No.
so- and I don't know if your audience will know it, but most contemporary poets don't write in rhyme and meter.
No.
So I'm considered sort of unusual in that way.
But you see,
That
but
I
their exposure most likely is going to be Shakespeare and the
yes,
classics where
yeah,
we're going to recreate this style.
that's
And
right.
we don't talk that way.
Yeah. So I'll read you a sonnet. And in these three books, I sort of became a fan of writing sonnets about little artifacts of war. Um, like there's a poem in here about the little clicker that was used after D-Day, and it makes a kind of cricket chirping noise, and it was used for soldiers to identify themselves to other soldiers in the dark. So this is about a different artifact, and it's about the whistles that were used to call the soldiers out of the trenches into no man's land
Mhm.
during World War I. So it's called trench whistle. I call my dogs with it, a blast of sound that summons them from far across the grass. And they come running at the trill, each hound a blur of lead gray fur, a yipping mass. They only know the pleasures of the lawn, the clovered fragrances. This cry I make is like a strident bird that's quickly gone, the branch now bare, the air that seems to shake with what was there before. They can't conceive this whistle mobilized whole companies of men. Its voice was sharp enough to cleave the clamor of the front, the batteries of mortar rounds. I call, and each dog runs, unhunted by the terror of the guns. So, with a poem like that, I'm sort of bringing together. By the way, I have one of those dogs sitting next to me on the couch right now throughout this conversation.
My dog is right here as well. Yes.
I wanted to bring together like a modern domestic space, like you're outside in the backyard, your dogs won't are refusing to come inside, and then taking this artifact of war and knowing its history and blowing on that whistle and realizing that the dogs just hear the sound. They can't possibly know the whole traumatic narrative that lies behind this simple object. And I
And
sort
the
of,
untouched by the guns of war,
yeah,
what a powerful component. Like it's just so benign and tranquil. It's just come in. It's just a signal. Hey, come in. But then you add that, and all of a sudden it's trench warfare that was among the most traumatic of wars that we've ever had.
absolutely. Yeah, and those objects really fascinate me, and I do think they're actually full of poetry. Um, I think it's the prequel to Civilians in Dots and Dashes. I have a sonnet about the Armed Services editions, which were these tiny little pocket-sized books that were designed to fit in the uniform pockets of soldiers' uniforms. And these little paperbacks, they're made basically on like basically comic book
The
paper.
cheapest paper, yeah.
The cheapest paper possible. They were not meant to last. And I have right across the room from me, I have one of those little Armed Services editions, and it's actually a little volume of poetry. And the Armed Services editions were responsible essentially for creating a whole generation of readers. One of the reasons why The Great Gatsby became a renowned novel was because it was produced as an Armed Services edition.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and all these soldiers read The Great Gatsby, a book that had largely fallen out of print and was not treated as a great classic. And they came back from war having read all of these books, and they became readers. And I just love that story. And I love that this tiny object, this little book, is designed to fit on the body. And
there's a bunch of those. That's
there's so many.
Yeah, and it's the concept of getting something for the soldier. They have little Bibles and New Testaments, but also novels and all sorts of things that are designed to fit in the front pocket. And you have to have really good eyes. And as I'm starting to get older, I'm realizing, I don't think I could read them today, because they're printed in the very small print for the young soldiers that can see everything.
That's right.
And they changed really how we do a lot of things, because they exposed that literature, but also the exposure to new, exciting, but also very dangerous environments. Have a greater appreciation for art and beauty. I think those two things, great destruction and death on one hand, and great beauty and life and exposure to that dichotomy is probably one of the most duality of man things that brings us to great art.
Well, and as you know, like, the story of combat is moments of great excitement and terror and long stretches of profound boredom. And what fills that boredom? Well, it's conversation, but it's also things like reading or thinking about, beauty, or thinking about, like, what's the meaning of all of this? And I think that's why, war literature remains a timeless topic. It's not just that we keep having wars, it's that war asks us to think about the most important questions of what it means to be human.
Yeah, these existential questions come to the forefront when there's a good chance you might die.
Absolutely. And so I'm honored to be part of that conversation and to have a small place in it. I mean, I only write from within my lane, and that's why the poems are largely about marriage and the home front, because I would never presume to write from my husband's experience on a ship. There are poems in which I try to imagine what that experience is like, but always with the emphasis that this is an active imagination. Because that's
which
sometimes
at times I'm sure you were much worse than it was, or much better than it was.
That's right.
And I've seen that in my own life. My wife, when I was deployed, it was, oh, you're living in the lap of luxury, and then mortars are going off, and there's a lot of bad things that are happening. That situation changes dramatically.
Yeah, you don't, without a lack of with a lack of information, you fill it in with your own narrative. In the first of the 3 books in Stateside, I have a poem called Against War Movies, where the person in the poem is imagining her husband dying in all these different war movies. And for me, that was like the first moment where I realized, oh, this marriage is going to change me in a profound way, because very early on, I started realizing that I was having trouble watching war movies on television because I would project my husband into every scene. What I realize now is that I was engaged in a kind of anticipatory grieving. I think my mind was just trying to, like, come up with
you a little bit.
Yes, come up with different scenarios of catastrophe so as to figure out, well, how would you respond if this disastrous thing happened? And I think that's also for when you're a writer, what the making of the art can do for you. It can allow you to move through different futures and different possibilities and think to yourself, well, how would I handle that?
A little bit of inoculation, so to speak.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. And I think that's why often military spouses are drawn to, say, like creative writing workshops, because there's a sense of like the value of self-expression and how that can allow you to work through complicated and scary things.
I am so impressed. I'm not a poetry reader, but I was like, ooh, this is awesome. And I started reading more and I was like, okay, this is really cool. And I am so glad that you came on the show and not only to share the books, which you have the new one coming out, Civilians, coming out next month in February.
Yeah, any day now.
Yeah, so that's very exciting. But this is the third. It's a trinity of thoughts. The first one is sort of the conceptual, and then dots and dashes, and now Civilians, the ebb and flow of service and communication and really post service.
That's right.
Probably the hardest of the things. I can't tell you how many times I have of colleagues and friends or know people that have served 20 years and they've thick and thin. And then soon as the service member retires, there's a divorce. All of a sudden they had to get to know each other.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
and they didn't adapt and grow, and it was okay, that portion of our lives is over. I'm moving on. And that's a real fear for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of chaos, and I think you address some of these fears well. So folks, go check it out. Where can people go find your books?
Well, they're certainly available on Amazon, and they can be ordered through your local bookstore as well. Civilians is published by Louisiana State University Press, so you can always order directly from the press too.
And we'll put all the links in, and so folks, you don't have to write it down. If you're interested, we'll put the links in so you can go find all the books, so you don't have to go hunt for them. That's the hard part about when you're driving, and I've done that a million times, and some website or phone number or something, we'll put it in the show notes, so you'll be able to go find it. Thank you so much for coming on Coming Home Well. I am sure that I have asked a bunch of questions, but I'm sure there's something I should have asked you. What should I have asked you? But I didn't.
I think you sort of touched upon it, but like how, if you're afraid of poetry, but maybe kind of interested in discovering it, can you do that? And I would say for any listeners out there, if you've been sort of interested in this art form, but are maybe intimidated by it, if you can just start reading a random poem every day by a different poet, eventually this weird art form will start to make sense to you. I believe that there's a poem out there for everybody. And so it's a matter of looking for, that small piece of verse that touches you or speaks to your experience that can eventually open up this whole new world for you. Because I think the thing that poetry does for us is it changes the way we see our own lives and the world around us. Because when you read a poem, if there's an amazing metaphor in that poem, that metaphor will stick with you forever and change the way you see something for good. And I think that's one of the amazing and powerful things about art in general. So don't be afraid of poems, listeners. They're not scary. They don't bite.
And don't worry about the rules as much.
And don't worry about the rules. And don't worry if the first time you read a poem, you don't understand every line. That's okay. There are poems out there waiting for you to discover them.
I think I remember something about art is the good artist follows the rules. To great artists know when to break them.
Yeah, so I'm a believer in like learning the tradition, learning as much about the art form as you can. So that way, when you break the rules, you know exactly how you're breaking them.
And it's
And you
done with
know
intention and purpose.
exactly, exactly. That like the goal is to be as informed as possible so that then when you're making choices on the page as an artist, those choices come from a place of intention and knowledge and craft.
Jehanne Dubrow is a award-winning all sorts of authors. And this is the cool thing. This isn't just Tyler coming up with this. It's been a lot of different folks have had you on to talk about your poems. They're being taught at the Naval Academy, the Townsend Prize for Literature, uh, NPR's Fresh Air. I listen to NPR's Fresh Air all the time. I probably heard the segment when it happened because I listen all the time. And so there's a lot out there. And the cool thing is, if you want to get into poetry or just read about military spouse poems, here's a whole collection just to get you started. And the cool thing, we have the internet, folks. You can find a poem a day just to get you started, just to get you thinking about how you would like to express yourself and share your story as well. John, thank you so much for coming on Coming Home Well, and really thank you for sharing your life through poems, because that's a lot to share. That's
Thank you.
it's a big heavy lift, and you
Yeah,
can see
thank you,
it with the
Tyler.
emotions and the thoughts and the fears and the concerns, and a lot of things come out very much in your poetry. So it's quite magical.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's listening.
Thanks again for coming on Coming Home Well.
Thanks for joining us this week on Coming Home Well with Dr. Tyler Pieron. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well, this is Coming Home Well.